to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, we must wake up to the new reality, 20th of September 2014. Labor's open border policy during its terms in government is starting to show the cracks which many voters feared would be the result of their recklessness. Its experiment with immigration by applying Rafferty rules to anyone seeking safe haven in Australia via the back door diluted the standard procedures which has protected Australians since Federation. Regardless of the current high terrorism alert and cleansing operations netting individuals intent on applying their murderous acts on us, we still have contributors to these pages who consider we have nothing to fear. Wake up, people, to the reality of today's world. Malcolm Taylor, Ardross. Okay, there's several things wrong with this letter. First up, Labor did not have an open border policy. We've never had that policy. Labor and Liberal governments alike have basically got the same immigration policy. That is, if you want to migrate here through regular channels, as it were, there's an incredibly stringent process you must go through, that you must essentially prove that you are going to be beneficial to our economy and our community. There are stringent background and security checks. This is the same under all governments. As far as I'm aware, has never been politicised, and nobody's changed those requirements to make them any less for any good reason. There has been an increase in economic migration to this country under both Labor and Liberal governments. Things like 451 visas, which have allowed essentially skilled workers to come here for our economic benefit on temporary visas. But as far as I know, they go through the same background and security checks. And those, I'm almost certain, are not the people you're complaining about. What you're probably complaining about is the humanitarian refugee intake. There is a fixed number of spots available here for people who are found to be refugees in accordance with the UN refugee treaties. The thing is, though, the policies of both governments have been and are basically the same. That is, if you arrive here by boat and claim to be a refugee, you will be taken to a third country. At the moment, it's Papua New Guinea and Nauru, where you will be locked up in a detention camp for many years while your claim is being processed. Part of that is background checks and identity checks. All sorts of security checks are done to make sure that you are not a threat to our community. Now, if you arrive here not by boat, so if you manage to get on a plane and then you claim refugee status, you are, I believe, detained in detention centres on Australian soil, and the same thing happens. As far as I'm aware, there are stringent security and background checks done, at least in part, by our spy agencies, and have been like that for at least the last 20 to 30 years, and I'm not aware of either government changing that. And therefore, anybody who's gotten in has gotten in by passing those requirements. That is, they've been deemed by the best and smartest people in our, most qualified to do so, they have been deemed to be safe to enter our country. The only difference has been in the numbers of boat arrivals that have been put in detention between Labor and Liberal. The Labor government, basically, once you arrived here by boat, once you got into Australian territory, and you managed to find a ship, you would be then taken to detention, which meant that they had several thousand in detention at any given time. The Liberal government has got a policy whereby if we intercept your boat, we will turn you back and drag you into somebody else's territory and say, no, go back to Indonesia. We'll actually put you in life rafts and sink your boat so that you can't then return. That's reduced the number of people getting into detention. I don't think it's changed the number of people who are given refugee visas, though. So I don't think the overall immigration rate has changed at all. It's just changed the numbers of people who are stuck in detention centres. That's it. And so to suggest that Labor had some kind of policy which allowed far more people to come in without stringent checks is simply factually inaccurate. And also to suggest that the standard procedures that Labor allegedly had diluted date back to Federation is untrue as well. There has been significant changes in immigration policy to Australia. And in fact, one of the darkest stains on Australian history was the White Australia policy, which was our immigration policy for a long time under all sides of the political debate. For a number of decades, Australia had an explicitly white people-only immigration policy, and this was enforced using ridiculous standards. They had a language proficiency standard which basically said that the government could require you to take a language proficiency test in any language of their choosing, that if you failed, you were not allowed to come into Australia. This meant that if we didn't want to let you in, the government would literally just choose a language you didn't know and make you do the proficiency in that test, even if that language had nothing to do with civil society in Australia. So there's documented examples of the Australian government forcing people to take language tests in Welsh and in Italian, precisely to deny those people entry here because they weren't white enough. That is the kind of immigration policy that we've had since Federation. The Labor government did nothing to weaken the current protections that are in law here to stop undesirables from coming into the country. The other thing is, when you're talking about terrorist alert and people in our society wanting to commit murderous acts on us, this is in reference to a recent raid, I think last week sometime. There was a massive police operation that raided a number of, literally dozens of places simultaneously across New South Wales and Queensland. Apparently there was a plot by some self-styled jihadis. They wanted to kidnap and murder by beheading on camera a member of the Australian public. So something along the lines of Lee Rigby in the UK. I believe these people also had links to ISIS. So they apparently had been recruited by some Australian ISIS member overseas to do this kind of stuff in Australia. Now, their plot was foiled, but of course it has caused a lot of angst. And you want to argue that we should somehow be more afraid because of this most recent thing. Now, I got several things to say on that. Firstly, this plot was foiled by our security agencies. To me, this is evidence that the security agencies are doing a good job. We've not had, as far as I know, successful terrorist attacks on Australian soil for a very long time. I can't remember the last one. This, to me, suggests that the security agencies are doing a good job. If you look at the stats, there's been something in the order of 1,000 Australians killed in terrorist attacks across the world since about 1978. So that's about 35 years or so. We've had about 1,000 people killed by terrorist attacks. There are about 2,000 Australians killed every year in normal non-terrorist murders. So about twice that every year are murdered. And that pales in relation to the number of people who die from things like car accidents, smoking related, obesity related, or even simply falling off chairs. So when you want me to be worried about the terrorism threat, I must say that the terrorism threat to me is very low compared to the threat of other things. I'm much more likely to simply be murdered by a non-terrorist than I am to be killed in a terrorist threat. So my fear of terrorism, I have calibrated to the actual threat of terrorism, which is low. The terrorism alert level is a relative risk, so we may be at a relatively high risk of terrorism, but overall, the kinds of things that are risky to me is not terrorism, and so my fear of terrorism is commensurately low. Now, that's not to dismiss the fact that the reason that it is low, at least part of the reason, is because we have strong security apparatus in this country, and I support that security apparatus. I just don't go around worrying about things that are not particularly dangerous to me. Next up, Rivers of Blood, 22nd of September 2014. There is no need for any jihad recruiter to bring horror to our shores because it's already here and deeply embedded in our communities. And the longer we pussyfoot around in dealing with it, the worse it will get. I have yet to hear of anyone who has had their passport cancelled or, better still, has been deported. The late Enoch Powell got it right many years ago when he warned the British government that their immigration policies would result in rivers of blood. James Harris Chidlow. Okay, nobody is advocating that we don't deal with the terrorist threat. As I've just said, we have strong security apparatus which are dealing with it. Those people were arrested. The security agencies were obviously monitoring them. They raided them. They arrested the people. Those people will be charged. And presumably, if they're found guilty in a court of law, they will be thrown in jail for a very long time. I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm not sure. In fact, I'm convinced that it's bloody stupid to suggest that we cancel the passports of or deport people who are Australian citizens. Firstly, I don't know where we're supposed to deport these people to. If they're not Australian citizens, then they will be deported. If you commit some kind of criminal act like that in Australia when you are not Australian citizen, you will serve some of your time in jail here and then you will be deported. That's what happens. And so I wouldn't worry about that not happening. If you're advocating that Australian citizens should be deported, I'm not quite sure where you think they should be deported to. No other country has any obligation to take them. And in fact, if they have Australian citizenship, then they are Australians, and they are our responsibility. I see absolutely nothing wrong with punishing them to the full extent of the law that we have here. And I don't see what deporting them is supposed to achieve, other than for us to somehow try to shirk our responsibility to deal with the bad people that we have living here. And anybody who quotes Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech, I'm sorry, frankly, the odds are that you are just racist and that you just don't like these people because they happen to be migrants. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech included a letter from somebody who was complaining about being the last white person on their street. It was straight up racist. I have no sympathy for terrorists, but I also have no sympathy for racism. And I have no sympathy for people who take the fear of racism and use it as a vehicle for somehow victimizing people simply based on the colour of their skin. That is pathetic. Wearing the Veil, 23rd of September 2014. So Bill Shorten condemns the calls for banning the burqa as ill-informed prejudice. WA Liberal MP backs calls to ban the burqa, 20th of the 9th. Does he not realise that for every woman who willingly consents to wearing the burqa, there's 100 or more who have no voice in the matter? Rosemary Fuller Inaloo. Citation, please. If this indeed were the case, then I would support measures to do something about the burqa problem. I'm not sure I would necessarily support an outright ban, but I would agree that the government should certainly be doing something about it. The problem is, I strongly suspect that you are incorrect. There really aren't a lot of burqa wearers here in Western Australia, and those that do wear the burqa, I suspect, do so willingly. Now, I would be willing to be proved wrong, but simply asserting it is not proof, and I would need some evidence. I would certainly need evidence before curtailing some of the basic human rights that most people in civilized society take for granted. That is, the ability to wear whatever you like. Now, the other part of the burqa ban that's been periodically gets called for is the idea of the identity of these people. So that the idea is that people can wear the burqa and therefore we won't be able to identify them because we can't see their face. And so they might be able to commit all sorts of nefarious deeds. And the thing I've got to say to that is, let's deal with that problem when it happens. As far as I'm aware, there are literally 0 incidences of people wearing burqas getting away with crime because they can't be identified. 0. Absolutely 0. It's far more likely that people wear motorcycle helmets as a way of doing that. And so, if and when some burqa-clad woman commits a crime, an armed robbery or so, wearing the burqa, and gets away with it because we can't identify her because she's wearing a burqa, then I may well support some, call to limit burqa wearing. But until then, it's probably just a cover for your own racism. And I don't support that. As far as I'm aware, until you can give me at least some evidence, it doesn't even have to be strong evidence, but some evidence that there are all these women out there who are forced to wear the burqa against their will, up until that point, I just have to conclude that basically you don't like people wearing burqas. And I'm sorry, but the fact that you don't like it doesn't really hold much weight with me. Showered and Stirred, 23rd of September 2014. To all those in Perth on Sunday protesting the drying of the planet, plea on climate, 22nd of the 9th, and the Federal Coalition's lack of support for their view, I hope you were sufficiently hydrated thanks to Mother Nature. Greg Cook Mindari. Yeah. So there was a largish rally for action on climate change, and it happened to rain. Is this some kind of argument against climate change? No, that's just weather. Weather doesn't equal climate. And it's the same old lazy argument we always hear. Oh, you're saying that global warming makes us hotter, but it's still cold. Yeah, climate doesn't equal weather, and also the climate change that we are experiencing means that there will be more extreme events. The fact that it rained just gives you a little bit of something to laugh at, the idea of protesters getting rained on. Lastly for this week, Making Sense of Sharks, 23rd of September 2014. At last, some common sense thinking on the shark cull debate in Daniel Emerson's article. Barnett back down did little to boost beach confidence. Opinion 13th of the 9th. There has been far too much hype and hysteria regarding the whole thing. Since when did the predatory killer, like the great white shark, become more important than the life of a human being? There are so many beautiful sea creatures with which we can swim without any fear of them killing us. So please, let there be more sensible thinking on the shark cull debate. Margaret Platt, Bull Creek. Okay, so that's a straw man. Nobody's actually arguing that the value of the life of a great white shark is somehow more than the life of a human being. Those people who are protesting the shark cull, at least those people who are doing it from a rational basis, argue it based on a few things. So firstly, it's that the sharks kill very, very few people. It's about 2 a year, I believe, in WA. So one, the risk from shark attack is very low. Given the number of people who swim, 2 a year is a very small number and is completely dwarfed by all sorts of other things, like, say, car accidents on the way driving to or from the beach. Secondly, that the shark cull has no evidence that it was actually going to be effective. That is, that simply killing sharks wasn't necessarily going to reduce the rates at which people were killed by sharks, because there was no way of particularly targeting the particular species they wanted. So 80% of the sharks that were caught during the cull were undersized, so they were not the target-sized sharks. They were supposed to be targeting sharks large enough to kill people. So by their own stats, 80% of the sharks that they were killing weren't even the target sharks. There was not a single great white shark that was taken during the shark cull. So even if the great white, which is, generally thought of as being the shark that kills the most number of people, the shark cull wasn't even effective in killing those sharks. Okay, so it's low risk and the shark cull was unlikely to work. That's most of the argument against the shark cull. Also, that killing sharks is not a great idea, considering we don't really understand them and they're highly endangered. So you can't even argue that the shark cull at worst was having no effect, because we actually know the shark cull was probably going to be having a negative effect on shark populations for no benefit to the humans. So that's really the argument against the shark cull. And to call the great white shark a predatory killer is to ignore the fact that humans are predatory killers too. Not all humans, but not all great white sharks. So if you want to demonise them based on that, I would suggest you don't stack them up against humans who kill a whole lot of people in a whole lot of predatory ways. In fact, actually, one of the greatest killers in this country is suicide. 2,000 odd people die from suicide a year. So one of the biggest risks to people in Australia are people in Australia. Anyway, that's it for this week. I feel much better having had a rant. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.